I couldn't understand why there was money for some things and not for others. When the banks were bailed out, well, where did they get the money for that then?
And then I read the accounting model by Neil and Andrew and Richard. I just, wow, this is something. This could do with being in a book.
It explains how transactions flow through the monetary system. How does the government spend? Well, the government has the power of the purse, so it decides what gets spent. The Treasury says, pays this amount of money, and the bank has to make whatever entries it needs to do to make that happen.
Understanding government was a currency issuer and didn't spend like our own household budgets. That was the first step in beginning to connect those dots with real life, and it began to bring everything alive.
The neoliberals want to try and propagate the myth that they own all the resources and government has to get down on its bended knee and beg for a share of it. MMT shows that that's not the only model that's available.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And this is going to be quite the roundtable chat, as we're joined today by 4 of the people involved in writing and or editing a brand new book put together by the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, entitled Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers. And so we're very fortunate to be talking to previous guest and GIMS associate, Dr. Phil Armstrong. Hi, Phil.
Hi all.
And financial systems expert and GIMS associate Neil Wilson. Hi, Neil.
Hi there. Hi, everybody.
And for the first time, we're honoured to be talking to 2, in the words of Professor Bill Mitchell, national treasures, who are also 2 of the founding members of the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies. We're delighted to welcome Prue Plumridge. Hi, Prue.
Hello there.
And Claire Jackson Pryor. Hi, Claire.
Hiya, hi everybody.
So, Prue, let's start with you. Can you remember your first MMT light bulb moment, and how did that lead to the founding of the Gower Initiative?
Well, actually, the story begins with 2 people that I really have to mention before I tell you what my light bulb moment was. And it would be remiss of me not to mention Deborah, one of the GIMS founders, and Sue Davis. We actually met in the ether on Facebook in the early days, around about 2013 or 14, I seem to remember, when it used to be, that friendly place where people could meet up and discuss the issues of the day and explore ideas together. But sadly, those days are long since gone. But my first encounter was with Diagrams and Dollars by J.D. Out. Looking back on it and rereading it as I did yesterday, it all seems clear. But back then, it was like a foreign language. So then someone recommended Angry Birds. I guess that's where many of us might have started, with Stephanie Kelton. And I guess from that point on, I didn't look back. So, after that, Billy Blog became a regular daily port of call. And I began to spend a lot of time reading, not just to understand MMT better, but also to understand about mainstream economics and how neoliberalism had influenced government policy and spending decisions, how it had brought us to that place of vast poverty and inequality. understanding government was a currency issuer and didn't spend like our own household budgets, for me, that was the first step in beginning to connect those dots with real life, and it began to bring everything alive. That was the shocking part. And so in that initial revelation, the initial seeds of the Gower were born.
And as you wrote recently for the GIMS website's MMT Lens blog, quote, knowledge is the key to the power to change things, end quote. So let's say we're talking to a casually interested person and we'd want to encourage them to dig a bit deeper just to establish the human stakes. Why is understanding modern money so urgent and important?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day, as you do.
It's like Warren says, once the light goes on, you don't go back.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, there's knowledge and knowledge, isn't there? And, gathering, I guess, let's say knowledge about how high Everest is or maybe the date of the Norman Conquest. Well, it might be useful in the Brain of Britain competition when it comes to seeing the challenges we face. And I'm particularly thinking here of climate change and how we transition in a fair and equitable way. Then knowing about MMT really opens up a whole new world of possibilities, and it requires action. Once you have that knowledge, you can't, or at least I couldn't, put it back in that box and walk on by. Even, I guess, on the days when life seems a struggle, I'm confronted daily with the news, whether that's domestic or international, as part of my role as the author of the MMT Lens. And it reminds me quite starkly why I embarked on this journey, not just to explore how we might bring positive change. That's for today, but also for future generations. I'm speaking as a grandmother. My objective, always in writing the Lens, even tweeting, is to bring those ideas as simply as possible to people. Challenge the daily bilge that exits the mouths of our politicians, the journalists, government institutions, think tanks. And it seems to be getting worse. I'm sure everybody's noticed that. Once one understands governments don't spend like our own household budgets, then the real measure of economic competency is not a balanced budget, but how government spending and legislative policy impacts on our daily lives. Questions like, who does it serve and who are its beneficiaries? That's what I'm trying to convey when I write the MMT Lens or when I'm talking to people.
So, Prue, I think I'm right in saying that you're the person that brought MMT physically to the UK in 2015, when you organised the first official MMT event in London with Professor Bill Mitchell. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I helped Deborah Harrington organise that event when she worked as a policy advisor for the National Health Action Party. And we were so thrilled that Bill agreed to take part in our little event, which turned out to be not quite so little event, because the room was absolutely packed. And whilst it was quite daunting for both of us, well, maybe not for Deborah, but certainly for me, I'd never done anything like that at all. It was so inspiring to see so many people together, skeptics and converts coming together. But of course, it really didn't actually end there. I had a quite by chance conversation with an MMTer called Peter Martin, who had just returned from Australia, and that led to the next event in Brighton during the Labour Party conference in 2017. And
I was there, I think.
Yes, I think Claire was there.
I was there, yeah.
And I think Sarah might have been there as well, was she? I can't remember.
Sure she was.
It's such a long time ago now. So, we had invited Bill, who just published his book, Reclaiming the State. And again, we felt it was a real honour that he accepted our invitation to attend our event. And to my mind, this perhaps was the catalyst. I kept thinking something has to come next. And then early the following year, after a long conversation with you, Patricia, I think
I think I was in Peru.
You were in Peru at the time. And it was at that time that those seeds actually came to fruition and the GIMS team was born. So Sarah, Claire, Deborah, Jessica, Patricia and myself. Patricia went away and designed our fantastic logo. We then started developing content for the website, which was a job and a half. I mean, I think Claire will probably back me up on that, and so would Sarah. And then planning for our October launch, which was, again, a big thing for us. But, you know, it's really astonishing to me that such a young and small organisation funded by donation has achieved so much. And so I'd like to take this opportunity on the MMT podcast to thank all those who have played a part, however big or small, in that success. Really grateful to you all.
Claire, when you're not moving mountains and wrangling economists and editing landmark books in the development of MMT, not my words, the words of James Galbraith, no less, of the many hats you wear, you're the GIMS website manager. And I know you're keen, like a lot of us, to emphasize what MMT means for the NHS. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
I come from a poor background. I was raised in council house, and I unfortunately became ill when I was 9 years old. And I went to the doctor and I was in hospital that day. And my experience of being within the care of the NHS pretty much ever since. I mean, obviously, as a child, I probably thought it was a bit rosier than it really was, but I felt really looked after and people were trying to explain things to me. And throughout the years, I can see the changes. People haven't got the same sort of amount of time with people that they used to have. Not so easy to get appointments. And so many services have been dropped altogether. And I've noticed it wasn't just about the NHS. All of my growing up was around the services that were provided by local government or national government. We always needed benefits because my mum was a single mum after my father died. So we were always supported by the state until my mum I was already an adult. My mum got married and that wasn't needed anymore. So I've walked around and seen different people's ways of living when I could see that they haven't got secure housing, they can't get treatment they need, you know, when they're living in very small accommodation, paying lots of money for it. And, you know, I went to university. I was the first person in my family to go to university and it was quite a thing. And I can't imagine wanting to do that now because I'd be scared of the cost. You know, I was still having a grant when I went. How old I am. But, you know, it's I see everything has just been made smaller and harder to access over and over again. And it's been gradual, but it's been visible. And that's what's made me so angry. And I suppose over time, especially with the crash, the GFC 2007-8, you know, you start wondering, like, how is any of this possible? And why didn't anybody see it coming? You know, and then you find out later, obviously, that people did see it coming. They just weren't listened to. But it's been a very long, gradual process of trying to work out what on earth has happened and why things have become like they are. And I didn't come to MMT particularly quickly. You know, it was because I was raising my children, didn't have a lot of time, just trying to find things out. And one of the reasons for making the GIMS website was because it was so hard to get anything coherent that I could grip onto.
You've done a really good job with it, by the way. It's I keep sending everybody on that website.
Cool. I mean, yeah, lots of people have helped with the actual content. Neil's written stuff and Phil's written stuff and Deborah and lots of other people. But yeah, it's just somewhere to be that you can find these things.
On that topic, Claire, can you remember what the first MMT insight was that stuck with you?
It's difficult to be sure because, like I say, it was such a gradual process. But when the banks were bailed out, I think like a lot of us thought, well, where did they get the money for that then? You know, and why wasn't that a problem? And it really grated on me. And that was the main reason really for me to try and find out what was going on because I couldn't understand why there was money for some things and not for others. And I just kept going until I found something that made sense. And yeah, I went through a lot of reading material and things that were probably quite conspiracy theory-like. I ended up with MMT and it was like, relief. People are talking about things. People are making connections between things, and people are showing how things work. And my degree's in the science, so I'm used to wanting to know about how things work, and you can't just say something and expect people to believe you. You've got to show how it's done, or how it happened. And I wasn't seeing that in a lot of places, and they come to MMT and it's people have actually written down how this works. This makes more sense now.
A lot of the time, Patricia's an engineer, and Neil, who we're about to talk to, also from an engineering background as well. And, I think people who kind of are into tell me what's going on, tell me something falsifiable, end up taking notice of MMT, don't they? So, everybody talking here, we understand why understanding the monetary system is important and why word needs to spread. And in an effort to do just that, you two formed the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies. And now that's led to this new book collaboration. And because it's been such a long time since we spoke, maybe Neil, you could pick up the story from there. And just for new listeners, the last time we spoke to Neil was to talk about the accounting model for the UK Exchequer, of which Neil is one of the co-authors. And as I understand it, that work provides a lot of the meat of the first chapter of this new book. So Neil, if you're happy to, could you just remind the listeners what the accounting model of the UK Exchequer reveals in terms of broad strokes takeaways?
So the accounting model is an institutional analysis of the UK monetary system from scratch. It takes its data from the history of the Exchequer, from all the extant public documents that are out there, and also from lots of freedom of information requests we've made to Treasury, Bank of England, and lots of other places to try and work out what was going on. It explains how transactions flow through the monetary system. And what it shows is that there's a completely separate purchasing and settlement process from the tax collection process. The two are literally not linked at all. They're completely separate. And we can see that within the actual operations of Parliament, is that the payment side and the tax collection side result in two separate acts. There's the one that everybody knows, which is the Finance Act, the budget, the one that's everybody's shouting about, and we've already got the media jumping up and down about it, which is the tax collection side. And then we've got the other side, which is the purchasing side. And most people have probably never heard of an Appropriation Act, but that's actually what determines what gets spent. Not the Finance Act, it's the Appropriation Act. They're literally passed through on the nod. So what we found within the accounting model is that really there's no such thing as debt. What there are is people saving and associated balancing items that balance those in the accounts. And just to finish off, what it shows, this model, is that the UK system is probably the most MMT-ready system there is. We're not subject to the restrictions that the United States is, and they're already arguing about yet again this week. We don't have that. We've moved beyond it. I think we fixed that particular problem in about 1850. So for the last 150 years, we've had an MMT-ready system, and all we need to do now is use it.
For anybody new here, Neil is talking about the debt ceiling.
We used to have a debt ceiling here then.
We used to have what's called sinking funds, where you float debt and then you have a sinking fund to get rid of it. So that's why it's called floating debt, is because we have a sinking fund to get rid of it. Yes, you used to have sinking funds, which is what the debt was allocated against. So we used to have that, and then it all got consolidated into a consolidated fund. And then we had things called growing produce, which mentioned the surplus, and the thing called growing produce evolved into just meaning the balance on the account. And so now we've got growing produce means a deficit. So that's just the way words evolve over time. So yes, the history itself is fascinating.
So on the accounting model of the UK Exchequer, how did that work evolve into this collaboration? Who pestered who? I'm guessing there was a lot of Claire in there.
Well, yes. And we got asked to do a double chapter just after we'd finished
I'd like to make it clear that I have evidence that it was Phil's idea.
Okay. All right.
I found the email the other day.
Yeah. They wanted a big chapter to start off the book with a bang. So we just knuckled down and create. I mean, it is a better read, is the one in the book. Obviously, the accounting model text is designed to be a reference. It's very detailed. It's got all the accounting tables in there. It's got links back to all the various account documents. It's very, very dense and difficult to read. So we've taken essentially the nuts and bolts of the accounting model. We've added more MMT words into it so that it now reads like an MMT document, because we tried to make the accounting model document neutral. We tried to avoid using any MMT ideas or phrases in there. And then within this 14,000 word chapter, we've tried to summarize it all up and sum up what we think about the accounting model and what it means for taking MMT forward.
So just to put a button on it, Neil, this first chapter, which you co-wrote with Richard Tye and Andrew Barclay, is entitled, How Does the Government Spend? So be as direct as you like, or take the scenic route. Our listeners will love it either way, but do tell them, how does the government spend?
How does the government spend? Well, the government has the power of the purse. So it decides what gets spent. So it says, okay, we're going to draw up some estimates. The Treasury asks all the departments for what they would like to purchase in the next financial year and draws it up into a big document called the supply estimates. Those supply estimates are submitted to Parliament for approval, and Parliament doesn't even debate them. They just put them through on the nod. And from that is constructed what's called an Appropriations Act, which is a very large number in it that says, yes, you are authorised to spend this amount on those estimates. Then that budget is distributed to the departments, and the departments go away and purchase things. And when they get the invoices in, they type in some numbers into their computers. That goes back to the Treasury. And then when the Treasury is checked to make sure that they're authorised to make that expenditure, the Treasury instructs the Bank of England to pay everybody. And that's that. There is no opportunity, no legal mechanism by which the bank can say no to that order. The Treasury pays this amount of money, and the bank has to make whatever entries it needs to do in its books to make that happen. And that's how government spends.
As Warren Moses says, government checks don't bounce.
So we had a question, just as a follow-up, we had a question last week about government saving. Can you explain maybe a little bit of why the UK government cannot save, per se?
Yeah, I mean, it's the way that I would frame it is that what we call national debt is actually the other way around. If you actually move all the accounting around and you shuffle the accounts to where they ought to be, you'll find that the Bank of England would end up with an account at National Savings with a very large amount of money in it. All the commercial banks would also end up with an account at National Savings with a rather large amount of money in it. And then obviously there's the rest of us who also have a little bit of money in National Savings, but nowhere near as much as the bank. So the problem you've got with government saving, it's the other way around, is that what we would call government saving would then actually end up being debt. You know, if government tried to save, everybody else in the economy would have to go into debt to fund it. And we just can't do that because we can't issue the currency. It makes no sense. That's what causes collapses and recessions and depressions, is when we try to force people to borrow more than they've got the collateral to support.
The question specifically was about, okay, that we're familiar with the idea that when the government spends money into existence, we call it the national debt, but it really adds up to all the, let's say, pounds, sticking with the UK, all the pounds in existence that have been spent into existence that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. So they are the non-government savings. The government debt is, or the government's accumulated deficits, the government debt is the non-government's savings.
Yeah, the excess savings of the non-government sector.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So what we were being asked about was, so in that case, can we not say that when the private sector goes into debt, and, you know, because the private sector can create credit out of debt for other parts of the private sector, can we not call that government savings?
And the answer is no, because when the private sector creates debt, it also creates an asset within the private sector which balances that debt. So it already sums to zero. The private sector can't create anything. It can only create a net zero within the non-government sector. That's the fundamental issue, is that you can't do that. Only the government sector has the capability to be able to swing things across the boundary because it's got the power of the purse. It's that capacity, that power that matters.
Yeah, I think the confusion was coming from that what we're saying is, yeah, that when a private sector individual goes into debt and creates credit and pays it to somebody else, that credit that the somebody else received is a financial asset for them if they didn't go into debt personally to create that credit. I think where the confusion came in is that we were saying, but it's not a net financial asset for the private sector. So therefore, nothing's been created that the government can save, even if it could save.
I mean, fundamentally, what the government's doing is forcing its will on the private sector. Because it's got the power to do so, it's effectively saying to the bank, thou shalt create a deposit, and they have no option but to agree if they want to continue to transact in sterling. It's a straightforward coercion. The bank may prefer not to create a £200 deposit when somebody's pension get paid, but if they want to stay in the sterling framework, they have no choice.
I just wanted to clarify that there is no sort of, within the accounts that Neil had looked at, there is no pot of savings, say, or pot of money from which the spending actually comes out and somebody's checking the balance on that account before they do spending or anything like that.
Even if they are checking the balance, there's no power.
Yeah.
There's no power. You have to have somebody there who can say no. Who is the person who gets to say no and make it stick? Now, when you go to the bank and you say, right, here's my check, the bank manager will sit there and go, sorry, I can't pay that check. And then you go to court and you sue the bank and the courts will side with the bank. Now, if the bank does that to the government, the court will side with the government because the government's got legislation that says thou shalt pay this check no matter what. So that's the difference, you see, is that the government has got legislation on its side. Parliament has passed an act that says to the bank, you must pay this check no matter what. Whereas obviously in an individual's case, the bank manager can turn around and say, sorry, in these circumstances, I'm not clearing this check. And you haven't effectively got a leg to stand on. They will push back. So that's the difference, you see, is that government has the law on its side. If you had the law on your side, you'd be able to write whatever check you fancy for anything you want. And that's the situation that the government's in.
So we've talked about one of Neil's chapters, and Phil, we talked about your chapter a couple of weeks ago in episode 155. So now all that's left for you to do, Phil, is to describe the remaining 10 chapters.
well, Claire was saying the evidence, it was my idea, and it kind of was as a germ of an idea. But really, I'd have to say that Claire in particular, but everybody in GIMS took that little idea and planted it in the ground as like a seed and then made it blossom, without being too horticultural. And the idea really was a coalition of things. Because I wrote a book with Edward Elgar, which was my interview transcription to my thesis. One of the guys I interviewed, Tony Lawson, told me it would be a good idea. And I had a really nice time with it, Edward Elgar. I already had the transcriptions and I sent it to them. They let me, put my daughter's art on the cover. And they did it all for me. It was dead easy. So I had that in the back of my mind. This Edward Elgar, get things published. It's quite easy and it's dead exciting getting like nice pictures on a cover. And then I read this accounting model chapter by Neil and Andrew and Richard. And like, not to embarrass Neil with praise, I just, wow, this is something. This could do with being in a book. And I'd already made a small contribution to like a compendium book. I think it's something like Contemporary Issues in Heterodox Economics or something. So I think, well, that would be, here's something similar. What we could do is really get your Neil and these co-authors as like a big, the main meat of the book as a mighty chapter. And also what would be good is if we could recruit the big hitters of MMT, Bill, Randy, Warren, of course, try maybe get Pavlina, a few of all people we could really think of. But then I thought, well, hang on, they won't write a book for me. I can't ring these guys up and say, do you want to write a book for me? What we really need is some national treasures. Because, seriously, they'll write for them. So then, like, Claire, Sarah and Prue then threw loads of feelers out to these big hitters, and I'd have to say to Neil, he was straight in on the process more or less straight away with the famous, can you write your wonderful work, can you trim it down to 15,000 words? So like you said, he was already doing that. But Neil was already then persuaded to write at least one other chapter. Andrew and Richard were involved. Richard wrote a second chapter too. So really, we then got those kind of people involved. We managed to recruit Pavlina. We got a guy called Daniel Kostner who wrote the Jeff scheme. Deborah has written a chapter. There's obviously my chapter. And we just got all these people together to contribute to the work. And I feel a little bit of a con man in a way because my experience with Edward Elgar was mine. I told Claire, it'd be easy. We got all, we had lots of interviews with the various contributors. And in the end, It wasn't smooth. We got all of the contributors' chapters in. We had I'm trying to remember the other chapters. We've got obviously one from Bill and a joint chapter with him in as well. Apologies if any I've forgotten, because there are 14 contributors.
Don't forget John.
Oh, John, yeah, John C. Harvey. He was the first to put one in.
This chapter that we're talking about by John C. Harvey is just a little opportunity to bring it into the here and now. And, you know, John, friend of the show, and friend to all MMTs and just basically all mankind. And so he's done this chapter about exchange rates, which makes the case that MMT informed policies won't cause a currency collapse or high inflation or stagflation or the apocalypse. And I'll link to one of our episodes with John presenting these arguments firsthand. But to bring it to the here and now, Phil, people have seen quite recently that sometimes when, whatever you want to call them, fiscal surprises are unveiled, they can sometimes result in a depreciation in the pound against the dollar, as it did after the mini budget, and then before that, after the Brexit referendum. And things like this make headlines and get politicians fired and make voters scared of change. So how do we talk in simple terms about why these things happened, and what can we say to reassure people that a government spending for the public good won't result in a worthless currency, either in US dollar terms or in purchasing power terms?
Well, I mean, what I always say about foreign exchange market dealers is they're not predominantly ideologues. I mean, in the sense that they reacted to the Truss government by thinking she doesn't know what she's doing. So they sold pounds, and it was all in the news about, you know, the currency collapse. But what happened was it goes down to a certain level, and then the dealers start buying it back up again, and you don't really notice. And I don't really follow what the exchange rate is now, but they'll sell pounds and they buy them back again at some point when they fall to a level that they buy them back and make a profit. So it disappears from the news. Like now, I can't remember the last time anyone mentions the level of the pound. I mean, I don't follow the news as close. It's too depressing. I think at the end of the day, dealers in foreign exchange, they will speculate. You know, there's lots of reasons why they would. Now, you might argue that, you know, if a government set out to pursue policies to serve the public purpose, foreign exchange dealers might go panic and start selling pounds, but then they would buy them back up again because they want to obviously make their profits in pounds, and also the value of the pound is determined by the fact people need to transact in pounds. They pay their taxes in pounds. So the value of the pound isn't going to crash out off the scale, although politicians are frightened of that. And the other thing, fundamentally, if you wanted to, you could just regulate speculation out of existence. Bill Mitchell said, if you don't like it, you can get rid of it. I'm not saying you have to do that. I mean, ethically, I don't see why pure foreign currency speculation does anyone any good. No one's explained to me why it does. The legitimate hedging, yeah, I accept that. So at the end of the day, they're just Armageddon fears. There's no real evidence for it. And the actual fact, I just like to put it out there now, that let's say that a government came to power, understood MMT, understood the system, brought in a job guarantee, had a ZERP interest rate policy, full employment. Now, you're all dealers now. You can see that the British economy, well, it's working. The problem is you're all going to buy pounds because you can finally see that the British economy is operating at full employment, it's got stable prices, it's doing well. So the actual answer is that after a brief, in my opinion, I can't predict the future, after a brief flurry of activity of selling and speculating, the value of the pound would have constant upward pressure on it, you know, which is another issue. And as I say, you don't like speculation, get rid of it. Obviously, John's chapter is a great chapter going back to that. You know, I'm not an expert in exchange rates. You know, I'd obviously recommend to your listeners, get the book, read John's chapter, listen to what John's got to say about it. You know, that'd be my kind of view of that chapter.
It's not, I mean, when you look at a chart and you go, you know, you take the long view, Patricia, you could probably correct me on this. When you take the long view, there's a lot of, I think, what they call reverting to mean, or do you know what I mean? Like, it's not the case that there's a shock and then all of a sudden, oh, that means we're heading for a completely worthless currency unless the Bank of England intervenes or something like that. You know, it does stabilize.
I wouldn't say I'm an expert on exchange rates, but, you know, you get these shocks and you see a lot of volatility. but it does tend to revert back, as you say. And that goes from both ways on things like, for example, when they raise interest rates, and you may see some effects of that, they dissipate pretty fast. Am I wrong in this, Neil? Is there anything?
No. I tend to avoid the pound dollar. And the reason is because the dollar is a reserve currency, and it tends to strengthen for other reasons across the world.
Right. Yeah.
For me, the most useful one is the pound euro. And if you look at the pound euro rates, you'll have noticed the collapse that we were all shouting and bawling about between March and May this last year. Obviously, that was all over the news and everybody heard of it, except that it wasn't. And that, if you actually look at the actual data of the year's currency, you'll find that the actual drop from March to May is larger than the very small drop and recovery that happened during the political turmoil in September. So yeah, it's largely noise as far as I can see. And as usual with speculation, once all the speculators have disappeared, the real numbers come out. As they say about the markets, in the short term, it's a voting machine. In the long term, it's a weighing machine.
I think it's different for developing economies, though, when you get foreign denominated debt, and that it's different.
Yes, it's smaller economies with smaller currencies have different issues, but they could have the same issues of us if they could actually resolve the internal political issues that they have.
But Phil, even in your analysis of, say, Weimar Republic, it was all, again, related to foreign denominated debt, wasn't it?
Well, yes, that was basically the idea of, obviously with the reparations question, there was huge amounts of selling of paper marks on the foreign exchange market, which of course the German Weimar government was required to do via the agent general. So if you can imagine that basically there was just a constant flow of Weimar paper marks being sold on foreign exchange markets without hardly any counter demand the other way. So that crashed the exchange rate. I can't remember the figures, but it was like billions to one. Now, obviously, German economy wasn't very strong. They're having to import things. So the prices of, their internal prices were much, much higher. And then the government felt compelled to, obviously increase the money supply, the paper mark printing, to enable people to operate at those price levels. So in terms of, it only works, the chronology, if you've got the initial problem with the reparations, without going through all the details of the history, then people selling huge amounts of marks, the crash in the value of the mark, but that's a catastrophic fall. And obviously a lot of people try to compare, everyday movements in exchange rates in Britain, to the Weimar Republic. And it's all this disingenuous stuff. And there's the same type of people who would say, if the government spends too much money, we'll end up like Weimar. And they're the same types of characters, people who are always predicting Armageddon. The same sort of people said Japan would be bankrupt about 40 years ago. Last time I looked, it was doing okay.
The thought is, or the talking point is, as soon as the Bank of Japan takes their hand off the scale, it's going to go through the roof, and the yen is not going to be worth anything, and and that's what they're placing their bets on. It's like, well, you just said it. As soon as they take their hand off the scale, they know that they're not going to take their hand off the scale. It just amazes me that it persists, doesn't it? They call it the Widowmaker trade.
Yeah, the Widowmaker trade in Japan. They say in economics there are developed countries and there are developing countries, and then there's Argentina and Japan. And that, I think actually as MMTers, perhaps our next job is actually to study Argentina and Japan and try and explain, because obviously we can explain it very easily. It's the mainstreamers that struggle with them. I would just exclude those from the model because they don't fit.
Because, Neil, you touched on this a few beats ago, I just wanted to bring this up. Andy Haldane yesterday, who's the former chief economist of the Bank of England, said, I would have preferred the bank and other central banks to have started their rate rises a bit sooner. That would have helped a bit in nipping inflation in the bud. And that would have meant that we wouldn't have had those rapid rate rises at the same time as the economy was hitting the buffers, end quote. So, you mentioned what could happen if the UK keep pushing on interest rates, and, we could be turkey bound, the country, not the bird. And could you say a bit more about that?
The thing is that interest rate rise is like trying to drive a car by sitting in the back seat and moving your weight from left to right, when there's a perfectly good steering wheel if you actually went and sat in the front. So, the belief in interest rates amongst economists is quite astonishing. You look at it from just a straightforward control theory point of view, and you just think, how do you think this actually is connected to the wheels? I mean, seriously. I was reading an article yesterday that was flagged up to me by Simon Wren Lewis, where they're now sitting there going, oh dear, we appear to be paying a rather large amount of money to the banks on interest on reserves. How can we change that? And you just look at it and you're thinking to yourself, this is epicycles, isn't it? This is trying to maintain the Earth as a centre of the solar system. So yes, I mean, the problem that you've got is that, guess what? The more you put interest rates up, the more interest you pay to banks or other people. And that means they've got more money to spend, which tends to cause inflation. So why is Turkey in the situation that it's in? Because its interest rates are too high. And also it's importing too much food and fuel. It's got structural issues. Nobody's addressing those. Instead, we're still talking about interest rates. Honestly, it drives you mad. It really does. You're constantly pulling your hair out of this. Will you please look at the real things and stop worrying about interest rates, please?
I love the European Commission website has a diagram on the mechanism for monetary policy, the channels whereby it has an effect on demand. And even that diagram is extremely complicated, and it has like 4 different things that are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
But of course, you could look at that and say, okay, what is the net effect of this? And I don't think it works on anything other than pure faith religiously.
It's got to be a religious position. At this particular stage, it's got to be a religious position. I cannot fathom it at all. Because you can look at the accounting and where you're trying to handle effectively the relative dynamics between saving and debt. I mean, all we're doing at the moment is taxing people who have got mortgages and giving it to people who've got savings. You know, in an inflationary environment, guess what people who've got savings are doing in an inflationary environment? They're spending the interest that they've got. So it's nothing more than a redistribution. You're taking it off people who want to buy a house and giving it to people who've got savings in the bank so they can buy food. How does that actually reduce demand? So this relative attempt to try and shift the quantity of money, it's been tried for decades and it doesn't appear to do anything. So why don't we try something different?
Are you trying to say that when Thatcher raised interest rates to 17% in the 70s, that wasn't what brought inflation down?
That's not what brought inflation down. No, that's not what brought inflation. Inflation is an energy issue. It's one of the things that's in Warren's book, the 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds. It's got a wonderful quote in there when he says all dangerous inflation that he's known about has started off as a pass-through from energy price rises. It's a relative value story to start with. And then it becomes an inflation story as the distributional battle commences. Bill mentioned it Wednesday in his Helsinki talk when he was talking about the 1970s distributional battle. And he was saying that it didn't really dissipate until the recession of the early 90s.
And obviously the unions were a lot stronger back then as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Bill was saying it precisely that. The unions were hacked to death after the 1970s inflation. Their strength was crippled. They were unable to do anything. But even then, the distribution battle didn't stop until the Black Wednesday and ERM debacles of the early 90s.
I might just add one little thing about, the interest rate thing. I think there's something that Warren said, as Neil was saying about there's a sum in inside money in the non-government sector, credit equals a debit, there's a zero sum. So all that's really happening, you put interest rates up, you're redistributing from taking money away from borrowers and giving it to savers, and they assume that savers are likely to spend a lower amount of the extra money there than the borrowers cut down. So the economics terms of the MPCs are different. Now, that might well be true. Borrowers might be a bit more cagey in the sense of spending more, being able to keep up their spending, and they might have to cut back when their mortgage rate goes up relative to savers. But like he says, that effect is like a ripple in a pool. It's swamped by the fact that you're just pumping tons of income when you've got these debt to GDP ratios. And I think they still stick to that because basically that's the only thing they've got. They can't do anything other than raise interest rates to the central bank. Otherwise, just admit, well, kind of like Neil says, we're sitting on the back seat trying to drive it with our weight. They can't really openly say that Andrew Bailey, doesn't he get about 500k a year? And sit in the back of a car without driving it.
While we're on this subject of unions and, the real stuff, turning to the NHS and the public sector in general, I'm pretty sure we'll all be in agreement on this panel that public sector workers need those pay rises that they're striking for right now. But obviously the conservative counterpoint to this seems to be that public sector pay rises will only just embed inflation. So how do we argue against that talking point?
My view of that is like in the pandemic, we found out all we really needed, health service workers, public sector workers, teachers. So these are the people that really need to be rewarded. And one of the things that people say, wage price spiral. Well, last time I looked, more or less, health service is free. So if you pay the nurses more, well, it won't cause price to go because it's all free anyway. So it's net a bigger deficit for the government. But as we know as MNTers, the inflation is not caused by a government deficit. It's caused by, actually, thanks, Neil, because Neil spotted that quote and I put that in my latest paper for GIMS, but it's a cracking quote. So basically, they haven't got a leg to stand on. We all know the cause of inflation. Everybody knows that it's energy supply costs, which have started in the relative price structure and then obviously become embedded in when the government raises its prices for goods and services. But in this case, simple moral question, we know who deserves the rises. And so that's what needs to be done. And it's not going to put prices up directly, at least. So I'd start from that point. Obviously other people might have something to add, but that would be my starting point.
I think that's a great quick answer to go, well, tell me how the nurses getting paid more are going to pass that cost on to the end users, seeing as the end users aren't the ones paying for it out of pocket.
We do have to discuss the other side of the equation as well, which is that inflation is the market trying to distribute scarce supplies. And unfortunately, our terms of trade have weakened. So we can now obtain less energy and less food for our exports than we could previously. And that's a real loss. And that's actually got to be allocated across the economy. And the inflation is attempting to try and do that. And of course, the people who get hit by
Would you consider that a shock to the overall consumption?
It's fundamentally energy is the root of everything. You can't make anything without energy. So we have this situation where it just ripples through. As Warren says, it starts off as this relative value shift, and then you just get this impact throughout the economy.
And I just wanted to jump in there and just say, for anybody new here, what we mean by relative value is that the value of, say, or the price of oil has gone up dramatically against all the other prices. So that's a relative value shift, whereas inflation is a continuous rise in the price level. And the price level is like when you take a rise in all prices.
Yeah, the issue is that we've got to distribute this loss across the economy. So there's not even a debate going on as to who we should be asking to either cut back or make more. This is the fundamental problem that you've got, is that everybody's trying to defend their interests. Obviously, the interest rate rises, you could argue, is bankers and debtors trying to escape the effects of inflation. So you've got this situation where we're not prepared to have this honest conversation about, we just can't actually afford as much energy as we used to be able to do. So we need to ask everybody to trim back a bit. And if we all trim back a bit, then we'll be fine. We'll get through this. And then we need to crack on and improve our energy infrastructure. This is all a fault of government policy for the last 20 or 30 years that has just not secured the energy supply of the United Kingdom or the food supply.
So I don't want to get too technical, but I think this goes into the kind of conflict theory of inflation and this idea that, as Neil just said, all inflation is really different groups protecting their interests and trying to get more of the national output. And you need a trigger. And I think in this instance is being sort of the energy crisis. And then that triggers on this battle that just sees continuous price increases. Now, from what I've seen in history, this often gets resolved in favor of the wealthy, like crushing.
They've got the power, haven't they?
Yeah, exactly.
So they're going to use it.
But I'd like to see whether it's another way is possible, and some people are quite cynical about that, but I don't know.
Yeah, we have a problem in that we don't have the excess supply. Inflation is controlled if you're going to use market systems. By excess supply, we need to have firms competing for demand. There's got to be more people who are capable of creating electricity than there is demand for it. So that's where we need to get to. We've got to have this excess capacity. And of course, with lockdown and across the world and damages to supply chains, all that excess capacity has disappeared.
Well, since we're getting a little bit onto the politics of it all, I quite enjoyed Deborah and Jessica's chapter in the book, and she's talking about specifically the history of the UK political history and the concepts behind, austerity and this kind of market fundamentalism, with the Tories sort of basing, at least Thatcher, basing a lot of their policy on what they've read about Hayek, and this idea of freedom meaning, market freedom effectively, whereas the Labour Party, maybe before them and with Beveridge, had a more kind of collectivist view of what freedom represented. And it was more like freedom from poverty and freedom from all these ills, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that, whether you think MMT fundamentally pushes people towards that more collective view of what can we do as a society and how can we take responsibility of our shared destiny, I guess, or whether it doesn't undermine at all this kind of neoliberal approach to freedom.
Where people start and what their reasons are for worrying about these things. I mean, if you're a genuinely, everything's about me kind of person, then it's not going to change your mind. But what I think for most people is that they accept that certain things can't be done because we can't afford it, and you just have to put up with it because that's the way it is. And then if you find out that things are somewhat different than that, and we can do more and we can help more people, then I think a lot of people will go for that. They're not heartless people. They're not voting for who they think is going to be the cruelest. They're voting for the people who they believe are being responsible and won't pass debt on to our grandchildren, this kind of thing. But I really believe that if people understood that we weren't going to be doing those things, then they would be taking a more collectivist view.
I think it's down to this concept about what we're actually about, and whose are the resources of the nations, and who gets to have first dibs. So the neoliberals want to try and propagate the myth that they own all the resources and government has to get down on its bended knees and beg for a share of it. Whereas MMT shows that that's not the only model that's available. The other model is available, which is that we elect a government and it goes around and takes the resources first for the public good, and then the private sector gets to play with whatever's left. So that model, they don't want that to arise. They don't want that to be an option. They want to say that there is no alternative to the government bending knee. And for me, MMT shows that we've got that other option available.
Just to de-scarify that other option for people who may be to the right of centre, I'm with you, Neil. L. Randall Wray has said in the past, MMT is consistent with a small government and it's consistent with a large government.
No, he's right. He's got a chapter in his book he's got a section, MMT for Austrians.
Right.
So, and he writes it quite well. The argument that we should actually have is it more efficient to do things this way or that way? Put your cards on the table. Let's have a chat about it and see what works and what doesn't.
What do we want to do and how are we going to achieve it?
How are we going to achieve it? Yeah. And this is it, because we can then talk about things in real terms. We have this amount of people. How many of them are going to be doing this? How many of them are going to do that? How many of them are going to be doing the other? And what's the best way for that to be organised? We're not going to solve social care issues just simply by praying to the gods. It's going to have to be sat down and talked about, thought through, and worked out how best to do it. You don't really want to be halfway through a heart bypass operation and your hospital goes bust and you have to pick a new one. It doesn't really work. Competitive market functions don't really work in that sort of situation. This is the trouble you've got with these, I'm a free market, everything must be free market. It's like, really? Well, there's an example. Solve that one. And these are tools. Markets are tools. Government provided services are tools. Which tool is appropriate for which job?
And I think meta-analysis is that markets arise out of governments. Markets arise out of the creation of modern money, which is, the MMT money story or chartalism. The government imposes taxes denominated in a unit of account that only it could create. And now that means everybody's got to get that token that only the government can issue. And hey, presto, you've got money. And markets come out of that, and then obviously governments spend more than they tax back. So now there are these leftover whatever, money tokens, and then that's where your private market comes from, and nobody wants to get in the way of that. It's good at doing some things, but like you say, when it comes to like hospitals going bust, or the queues are just piling up in the NHS, the staff are having a really hard time, and the resources exist and they are for sale. And the ones that aren't for sale, okay, so we can train new staff.
We can make the professions more attractive by not putting all the people who want to do it in debt as soon as they start training.
Yes, that's right. We can have medical schools who don't change their teaching staff every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
That would be useful. So yes, there are significant structural issues, and arguing over ideology is not the way to actually solve these problems. We need to get these things fixed, and we just need to use whatever is the best tool to get that job done.
There's a guy called Polanyi who I mentioned I'm a great fan of, and he talks this idea of embedded and disembedded markets. Really, his idea is, like Neil was saying, markets are a tool, but you have to use them appropriately. Like you use a hammer, put a nail in, but you don't use it very effectively, clean your windows. Now, what you can try, I don't recommend it to any of your listeners. So really, the right say the government is always wrong. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and a lot of these things do, but markets are always better at everything as a matter of course. And because of that, they need to be disembedded. And I mean, Bill Mitchell's written things. By that, I mean, not fancy so they should be over and superior to democratic governments and what we want, because they kind of, through some mysterious force, know what they're doing and how to use resources well, and the government really doesn't. And that's always their starting point. Whereas, like we said, if you start from the point of we have problems to solve, we have limited resources with which to deal with those problems, some of them will be best dealt with by government or central provision free at source to the user, like health, education, etc. And then, to use Neil's phrase, gets first dibs. Absolutely. So democratically, we decide the government gets first dibs on this amount of resources, and markets are made to serve us, not the other way around. And, I don't like it when, you meet a politician who says, well, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that, but the foreign exchange markets and the bond markets don't like it. Well, you gave them the power, and it's reframing that debate, as we always say, right, what do we want to do? How do we want to achieve it? How big do we need democratically? Do we need the public sector to be? And why do we want it like that? And then how big should the private sector be? So you frame your debate. And MMT allows us to see this other way of doing things, that Tina, the Thatcherite one, it isn't right,
What I love about MMT particularly is that because it, at the moment, a lot of economic discussion is all very technocratic. There's only one answer, one solution for every problem. And it's like pressing buttons in a machine, and MMT just basically points back to, well, we need to decide what is it that we want, what outcome that we want. We actually have to think about what we want from our economy. And I think that it brings back attention to the notion of democracy, and I like that it then goes to say, well, okay, maybe we need better democratic systems. We need better methods of accountability. If economics is actually about deciding who gets what or whose interests come first, then we need to make sure that everybody is heard in this conversation.
Yeah, it's putting the politics back in political economy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting the affordability in money terms off of the table. But, I think you hit on something there, Patricia, that, when you give people that freedom, there's a sense, and it might be a British thing, that, or a class system thing, that when you go, okay, as a nation actually free to spend what we want on what we want, given the resources that we can call into being through our monetary system, that gives people what I'm going to call a sense of ideological agoraphobia. They're like, I need you to tell me what to want. Don't tell me I can do anything. That's, and I think it's 99% of us are probably, are kind of descended from serfs, right?
Yeah, that's definitely true.
But once you get used to these ideas, the ability to be able to think that way gets easier with time.
Right.
Yes, it is difficult to imagine things in the beginning because it's such a big world with so many problems. But he's running in the background of your mind continually once you begin to understand that things can be different.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of think that people are now beginning to see the consequences of government choices, over the last 10 years through the politics of austerity. And also, at the same time, they're beginning, I think, to understand that there are contradictions in what we are told about how government spends. This magic porridge pot that whistles up endless funding for your wars, bank bailouts, and the PPE manufacturers, whilst the state of the nation declines. And here, what I'm really talking about is our lived experience. So, to my mind, the change will only come through knowledge and understanding that lived experience results from political choices. And at the end of the day, people really want to know how it applies to them, their families, their communities, wider society, and addressing the climate crisis. And it's about society deciding what their priorities are, in my view.
We're surrounded here by people who, are part of the initial MMT crowd of the UK. And I think it's a good thing that the audience gets to know what is it that actually motivates you, behind just simply telling economic truth and how things work. It's not so much about that you're obsessed about the mechanics of economics per se, but or you understand that the description per se has a political impact.
So what can we do with it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that drives it for my involvement the whole time. I mean, I'm never going to be a Neil who can sit and go through all these documents from the government and try and work out how things are going on. I want to.
He did it so that we don't have to, basically. Thank you for that.
I mean, Neil said to me once, I think it was about one of the articles he put on the site, we all run together, and we all have our own little different things we can do. And that's something I would say to anybody who thinks that they can't do anything to help. You don't have to know everything. I will never get even close. But I can still do things. I can still understand why it makes a difference, and I can still help.
Well, I think like Claire, I still sort of feel a bit of a baby when it comes to MMT. I'm still on the starting blocks, but in my sort of simplistic and rather simple world, I sort of feel that economies can really only function properly, if we're serving the public purpose. And what I mean by that is, investment in quality public and social infrastructure. Now, you might remember in 2016, during the great Brexit battle, it seems rather a long time ago now, given what has happened in the interim, that Jeremy Hunt said, and I quote, that a strong NHS needs a strong economy. And he was implying that our public services were dependent on tax revenue. So, of course, apart from misleading the public on that score, he also got the thing totally the wrong way around. A strong economy needs a strong NHS first, and indeed public services that are fit for purpose. And for me, that's the starting point. And those are the political priorities we have to decide upon.
I think we've been driven to try and understand the ins and outs and the complexities of the money system so that we know what we're talking about when we say we should do it this way around. In fact, there isn't really an alternative to this, really. Or, we've been attempting to manage the economy by, moving interest rates here and there and drastically and drastic times. And it doesn't work. It's got a huge body count and, let's do something else.
We have to understand it pretty soon, don't we? Because we have the climate crisis is sort of like this big tsunami ready to engulf us. And that seems to have even gone off the boil now. So it's rather sad, in my opinion.
So that said, we're trying to connect the theory to real life and emphasize how important it is. But now we're just going to take a little turn back into the technical world again. So turning back to Neil. Neil, in response to those who say that MMT ignores the taxation side of fiscal policy, you wrote a chapter entitled Tax as a Hygiene Factor, Setting UK Taxation Policy Using MMT. Tell us about that chapter and what you mean by a hygiene factor in this context.
So a hygiene factor comes from the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. It comes from a work by a chap called Frederick Hertzberg, who came up with the motivation hygiene factor theory, or also known as the two-factor theory. And that's to do with the way that people work and how they do their jobs. And a hygiene factor is something that needs to be done, needs to be there so that work can actually be done. And that boils down to, in job terms, things like, enough salary and decent job conditions and, a nice place to work, those sort of things. If those things exist, then work has a chance of happening. If they don't, then work doesn't happen, as we're seeing now with all the strikes around where those hygiene factors have been violated. And I was using that as an analogy for the tax system, because tax is really a hygiene factor. It's something that needs to be done. It needs to be done right, but it's not really the driving force in the system. The analogy I've been using recently is to think of a motor. In a motor, there's a coil and a set of permanent magnets, and you vary the current in the coil, and that speeds the motor up. Now, tax is really the permanent magnets. That doesn't really change. The actual variable bit in economic terms is on the other side of the balance sheet. The bit that we vary is the amount of government spending that we put into the system. The tax rates, the tax system largely stays the same over the cycle and just operates like the permanent magnets in the motor. You need them there to make it work, but it doesn't really change. So in my chapter, what I've done is I've tried to simplify down the UK tax system into two characteristics that form the basis of every tax system and the drivers by which it uses tax. And those are that we need to release the resources for the public sector. So tax is all about reducing the number of jobs that are available in the private sector. That makes people unemployed. And those unemployed people are then available for the public sector to hire for the public purpose. So that's the first and most important reason why we tax. And the second one is that we have to drive the currency. So the currency needs tax. It needs to be a broad-based tax across the jurisdiction so that people will actually accept the otherwise worthless token that the government issues. And those two things are in conflict because releasing the resources requires very specific taxation. So you can release the specific people that you need for the public sector to hire. And the driving the circulation requires broad-based tax that goes all the way across the jurisdiction and make sure that there's always somebody across the whole area who has to pay tax so that the distribution of the currency will go across the whole of the currency area. I see those as being really the only two reasons why we tax. Now, in the UK, we have different terms for the other things that you can do in terms of taking money off people. So things like duties and excises and fees, levies, those are all different terms for taking money off people. Now, those things are what I call political choices. So when you put duty on cigarettes, say, then what you're trying to do is eliminate cigarette use. So you can't rely upon that duty as a mechanism by which you can release resources. It's not there for that purpose. It's there to stop people from using cigarettes. And generally what you would want to do when you impose a political levy or a political duty is you would want to put a matching subsidy on the other side. So, for example, if we have fuel duty on carbon-based fuels, we may want to put a subsidy on vehicles and electric charging points. If you match the political levy to a political subsidy, that makes it very clear that that is not available to match the general spending that we do with government services. So, further on in the chapter, I then go on to look at two other points, which are tax incidence and tax salience. And those are quite important because I see a lot of time when people talk about imposing a tax on certain people, and they expect that tax to be absorbed by that person. And tax incidence and the research into tax incidence shows that that isn't the case. If you tax a rich person, that rich person has power. They will then just take that charge and they will pass it on to somebody further down the line because they've got the power to do so. So you have this problem of taxes not staying where you want them to be. That's tax incidence. The other point is tax salience. And tax salience is whether you recognize that you're being taxed. For example, in the US, they have an extant sales tax. So you go to the checkout with your $100 item, and they'll put 8% on top in terms of general sales tax. In the UK, you'll go with your £100 item to the checkout and you'll pay £100 because the VAT is implicit within the cost of the item. So that the interactions between tax incidence and tax salience is very interesting, and that shifts tax around the system. The tax system that we've got at the moment is ridiculously complicated. The most effective tax in terms of the amount that it collects and the reduction in the amount that it actually wastes is PAYE, of course. Everybody pays that at source, and that has a tax collection loss of something like 0.2% or something, which is far, far lower than any of the others like VAT or corporation tax. If you actually look at tax incidence and tax salience, that suggests that employer side taxes are more effective in terms of they tend to stay where they are. And see, as we're all about trying to reduce the number of private sector jobs, because that's what the purpose of tax is, to release people for the public sector, then it's likely to be the case that what we currently call employers' national insurance really ought to be the main tax, and that we should shrink the other taxes and focus the tax system on that. Make employer national insurance more progressive, make it wider, make sure that it covers everything, and effectively just use that. If we do that, then what that means is that everybody, when they receive their wage, will take home their entire wage because their employer is paying the tax. Now, of course, their employer already pays the tax. It's just calculated on your salary, and then the employer takes the money off you and gives it to the tax office. So all I'm really suggesting is that the de jure follows the de facto, that employers should take the tax and just give it straight to the Exchequer. The fundamental point with tax is that it's a secondary concern with an FMT. It needs to be there. It has to do its job, but largely we just leave it there. This idea that the mainstream put forward that we're constantly moving tax rates up and down in a discretionary manner, that's just not the case. Simply not the case at all. We set tax policy, it tends to stay there, and then we stabilise on the other spend side.
And just to sort of emphasize something that Warren would say, I think, if he were here, is that said, the MMT story starts with the government wanting to provision itself and then laying on a tax liability, because sometimes there's not a distinction drawn between liabilities and taxes, as in the tax revenues that you pay to the government. So that brings us to what we're going to do. And so moving into the home straight, as we record this, Rishi Sunak has just come back from an away day with his cabinet to try and come up with a strategy for, one would hope, running the country. We're aware of his recently stated 5 pledges, which include growing the economy by shrinking the national so-called debt, which of course will starve the economy he's trying to grow of investment. So there's that. And the Prime Minister is, I think, quite rightly coming under fire, even from within his own party, for not seeming to have any kind of plan to get from where we are now to achieving his goals. And I guess from our perspective, not only is the paying off the national debt to grow the economy thing contradictory, but then also improving the NHS dependent on this growth, because in their framework, growth in tax revenue is needed to, quote unquote, pay for improvements to public goods. And so to us, as we've been saying this whole episode, that's all totally backwards. So what should we as MMTers be advocating for if we had the ear of a political party, perhaps an opposition party?
Right. So a bit of research has been done that gives these top 3 priorities that people want done this year, which is bringing down inflation to stop the price rises of household goods, reduce the NHS waiting lists, and build a self-sufficient energy infrastructure. According to research, that's across the board, genders, ages, political persuasions. Those are the top 3 priorities of the British people at present. So what we really need to know is, what can we do to bring those about? Well, to bring down inflation and to stop price rises of household goods, we need to reduce the cost of energy, because it's the cost of energy that's causing the inflation. So we really should, before all this kicked up, have pegged the energy prices for households right back and stood that cost. And for my money, we should be transferring that cost across to discretionary imports and squeezing that side of things, which would then help strengthen the currency and bring our energy use back into line. Fundamentally, Our exports aren't as valuable as they used to be, and we need to be using more of that export capacity to obtain energy and less to obtain fripperies. And that's something that we can do to bring down inflation. Reducing NHS waiting lists. On this one, we've got to stand on the hot potato that none of the political parties would want to go there. And that is that private medicine is what is increasing the length of the NHS waiting lists. We have a supply side limitation in doctors, nurses and medical staff. Where do you think the private sector gets their doctors, nurses and medical staff from? From the NHS. So we need to give them back. And that we can do that one of two ways, which is we either confiscate the private sector, which is what we did in 1946. Perhaps we're not ready for that just yet. Or alternatively, what we can do is we can require the private sector deals with the NHS waiting lists first and puts everybody else on the back burner rather than the other way around at the moment. In a supply restricted system, private medicine means that those with money get to jump the queue. Is that right? Is that proper? Is that something that we should be permitting or encouraging? There we go. There's a debate. And the third one is built self-sufficient energy infrastructure. We have Rolls-Royce nuclear power systems in this country. We have as much wind as you could possibly want. We've got quite a lot of rain and water as far as I remember. So why have we not got every last man on this job? Why have we not got everybody on building our energy infrastructure out so that we're self-sufficient? Why are we sitting there doing demand reduction rather than building as much supply of green energy as we can? We should be exporting this stuff. We're a windy island. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing this other than nobody's got the vision to do it.
You've got my vote, Neil. Slam dunk.
Yeah, you deliver with passion, Neil. I mean, I think, short and sharp, 3 points, stick to that. I was talking to Fidel, and he was talking in similar lines about this idea of, the energy infrastructure required. We know where the inflation has come from. We've not done anything about it. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. This country should be as we were during the Industrial Revolution, we should be the leader in the production of energy systems. We've been building pressurized water containers since the 1820s. We're quite good at it. I think we've probably got that bit cracked by now. Why are we not using this technology, these things that we're actually good at? The world wants green energy, so let's just produce loads of it and export it and bottle it if necessary. It's not difficult, I don't think. It just requires the will.
Britain's a bit too obsessed. I say this like with a tongue-in-cheek. We're so much obsessed with finance and the city, that I heard something, Tony Benn speech about the end of Thatcherism, tweeted it, and it's so true now, that we have, quote, an utter contempt for skill, is what Tony said, and that we have all these skills, and Neil's talking about and more. We don't use them. We're too obsessed with finance and movements in the pound and stuff like ephemeral things, rather than actually making 3 sensible, realistic aims and doing it, rather than getting obsessed with the city, and financial stuff and thinking that, our wonderful financial sector is going to save the day. It's had its go. And to be honest, to me, it's more parasitic than anything else. And it actually holds us back. It doesn't drive us forward. I'd rather stick to Neil's points than, try to worship the ground the city exists on. But that's just my perception.
Again, now you've split the vote. I think, as long as you two are in the same party, you've got my vote.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's an old line, but Britain needs to get back to making things again. We were good at that, and we ruled the world when we were good at that. And we need to get back to making things, not necessarily ruling the world, but we need to get back to making things again. The world wants green energy, so let's just make it. We're an innovative people. If you live in an island where the weather changes 4 times a day, you have to be.
And there's also all this topic of resilience as well that,
Yes.
And I do think that, and wondering whether you guys agree with me, that there's been way too much focus on efficiency,
Yes.
This idea. We just specialize and rather than on other things like resilience and equality and all these other good things.
Well, you know that from biological system theory, there's a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. It's like a little, I would call it the Laffer curve. Essentially you start at the beginning and you go up to the top and then down to the bottom. If you have too much efficiency, you lose a lot of resilience. If you have too much resilience, you lose a lot of efficiency. And the optimal point is somewhere roughly along the middle of that. The trouble you've got with neoliberalism is it's obsessed with efficiency. So that just creates systems that are brittle. And then so as soon as we have something like the pandemic or an inadvertent invasion by a foreign power, everything falls apart because it's too much about prime path. There's no secondary paths. There's no backups. Why are we trying to pretend that we've still got an imperial system that will supply us with food and fuel rather than offer, a world market rather than making these things ourselves? You're absolutely right, Patricia. We need to be concentrating on making this country more resilient rather than relying upon supposed markets that will supply us across the rest of the world. I think the last year has shown that can't be relied on at all.
So to finish up, I've got one really hard last question for anybody that wants it. And I apologize in advance for the impossibility of answering this question. But here it comes. Tell me what MMT is in a soundbite. Anybody?
Okay. Well, look, the one I use is that we may have a magic money tree, but we don't have a magic porridge pot. And I think that's important that we understand that the limiting factor is real things, not pretend things.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Obviously, there's just too much to talk about in one sitting, so we're going to talk more about this new major work, Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers, in future episodes, and link to where listeners can get hold of a copy of the book in the show notes for this episode. But for now, Claire Jackson-Pryor, Prue Plumridge, Neil Wilson, and Phil Armstrong of the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast. That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.